Here we're going to look at operations with fractions, which will involve adding fractions, subtracting fractions, and multiplying fractions. Something that you may remember is that in order to add or subtract fractions, we have to have a common denominator, and as it turns out, that's not the case when we multiply. We're going to look at that in a few different examples. If we want to add 1/2 plus 1/10, your instinct might be, well, I don't know, 2/12? We can't really do it that way. What we've got to do is we've got to have common denominators. We've got to have denominators that are the same before we can add or subtract fractions. Here, what we're going to look for is a denominator that 2 will go into, that also 10 will go into. So what is a number that 2 will go into that 10 will also go into? Well, heck, both of them will go into 10. So I'm going to use that as my common denominator. You might hear that called the least common denominator or the lowest common denominator. It's a good idea to use the least common denominator if you find it real easily, like we did here, because it keeps all your numbers small. You'll notice on the right I had 10 as a denominator to begin with, so I don't need to change the numerator. That can just stay 1/10. I haven't really changed the fraction at all. But in the fraction on the left, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create a fraction that is equivalent to 1/2 that has 10 as a denominator. And so if in my denominator I've multiplied by 5, I also have to do the exact same thing to the numerator. I've got to multiply that by 5. And so a fraction that is equivalent to 1/2 that has a denominator of 10 would be 5/10. Now I've created a setup where I have a common denominator, so I can add these two fractions. And 5/10 plus 1/10 gives me 6/10. Something that you might see done here is, well, since 2 will go into 6 and 2 will go into 10, I could reduce this fraction, and instead of calling it 6/10, I could call it 3/5. As long as you're comfortable reducing fractions, that's perfectly acceptable for you to do. Let's look at another. Let's look at 5/6 minus 3/7. I can't subtract these because I don't have a common denominator. And honestly, off the top of my head, I can't think of what will 6 go into that 7 will also go into. If you find yourself stuck in a place like that, you can always just multiply your two denominators together and use that number as your common denominator. And that's what I'll do here. So 6 times 7, so I am going to create equivalent fractions that have a denominator of 42. Over here, let's see, 6, I had to multiply by 7 to get 42, so I've got to do the same thing to my numerator and have 5 times 7 is 35. So I've created an equivalent fraction that has a denominator of 42. For the other one, well, let's see, I multiplied my denominator by 6, so I also need to multiply my numerator by 6, and so 3 times 6 will give me 18 over 42. Now what I've done is I've created equivalent fractions that have a common denominator, so now I can perform my subtraction. And I have 35 over 42 minus 18 over 42, which gives me an answer of 17/42. Before we can add or subtract, we have to have a common denominator. One of the really nice things about operations with fractions is that when we multiply fractions, we do not have to have a common denominator. When we multiply fractions, we just multiply across the top. Here, 1 times 1 is 1. Multiply across the bottom, 2 times 10 is 20. And so 1/2 times 1/10 is just 1/20. A lot of times with the word multiplication, we will use the word of to represent that. And if you think about this for a minute, what would 1/2 of 1/10 be? Well, if I took 1/10 and I cut it in half, it'd be even smaller, so it would be 1/20. Let's look at one more multiplication problem. If I want to multiply 3/4 times 5/7, I'll just multiply across the tops. 3 times 5 is 15. Multiply across the bottoms. 4 times 7 is 28, and so 3/4 times 5/7 is just 15/28. Key things to remember are if you're going to add or subtract fractions, you need a common denominator. If you're going to multiply fractions, you don't.